I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
This is Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb, quoting the Hindu epic the Bhagavad Gita, namely the Lord Krishna, as he unveils his divine form as Kal, which roughly translates into time. Time is the force of creation, preservation, and destruction. Time destroys all things, but within that destruction leads to new realities. The concept of time would fascinate another prominent scientist who is perhaps the most iconic of all, Albert Einstein. His equation of E=mc² proved that an immense amount of energy could be released through a small amount of mass. This was essential to the atomic revolution, namely through the use of the element uranium. On August 2nd, 1939, Einstein, a German Jew who had fled the country as Hitler had taken control over the nation, would sign a letter alongside other physicists warning President Roosevelt that the Nazis were developing a weapon of which the world had never seen before. In response to the little supremacist with a tiny mustache, possibly becoming the destroyer of worlds, the United States, along with Britain and Canada, would form the Manhattan Project to create the destroyer of worlds for their own before Hitler did. The director of this project would be J. Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb. And in 1943, in the deserts of New Mexico, Trinity would be dropped. Now, thankfully, the Germans never got access to the bombs, but nonetheless, 2 would be dropped on Japan, ending the worst war in human history. The ethics of this decision are still debated to this day. Einstein said, quote, "I know not with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones." The quote is a testament to humanity's tendency to fall prey to old habits. The combination of outdated mindsets with cutting-edge technology is very dangerous. We operate with the technology capable of turning cities into ash, yet our brains are roughly the same as they were at the time when we were clashing with other tribes and fearing saber-toothed cats lurking in the bushes. War is natural. While it is nice to delude ourselves that the nature of humankind's state is filled with a bunch of multiracial stock characters prancing around the flower fields in harmony, anyone who has spent 20 minutes watching Animal Planet knows that this is not the case. In a world with limited resources, organisms are oftentimes wired for aggression, or at the very least, fierce competition. Some plants will grow in a certain direction to provide themselves with extra sunlight while they block out the light of other plants. Imperialism, colonialism, and conquest predate our civilizations. Monkeys will see a tree with fruit owned by another group of monkeys and kick them out. War is the standard of history. Periods of time in which there is relative peace are not peaceful because people wanted to go on yoga and meditation retreats, but rather because there was one big power capable of smashing all the smaller bullies into submission. War resulting in civilizational destruction is interwoven into some of our oldest stories in religion, mythology, and folklore. Ragnarok in Norse mythology, the Book of Revelation in the Bible, and going back to Hinduism, Kali Yuga, the darkest age in which nearly all virtue is gone, up until Kalki, the final avatar of Vishnu, appears to purify the earth and create a new age after the mass destruction. By the way, sorry for the mispronunciations. In our secular age, science fiction has provided us with ways of communicating our fear of the end times and hopes for a second chance afterwards. In the Australian post-apocalyptic film series Mad Max, the world plunges into chaos after a series of conflicts for oil followed by water, which result in a nuclear exchange. What results is a world composed of survivor rival gangs, with a fondness of heavy metal and BDSM fetish wear.
Oh, what a day! What a lovely day!
Snap back to reality during the aftermath of World War II, and the unholy alliance of capitalist democracies and communist states against fascism had crumbled once the common enemy of fascism had been vanquished. The Cold War had begun. The reason why we call it the Cold War is that it never went hot. And the reason why it never went hot wasn't because we were so nice to each other, it was actually because of nukes. The Soviet Union, through a combination of their own research and spying on the American, British, and Canadian scientific labs, would eventually get access to nukes themselves in 1949 and test their first nuclear weapons, the RDS-1. The UK, an ally of the United States, would use this research to test its first nuke, the Hurricane, in 1952. This would lead to an arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union on who could create the largest stockpile. The Soviet stockpile would prove to be the largest, but less technologically advanced than the Americans. This led to a concept called mutually assured destruction, aka MAD. It was a self-deletion pact in which a nuclear exchange would result in the destruction of both Cold War camps. Therefore, the Cold War didn't get hot. Again, not out of mutual respect or hugs and kisses, but rather as a result of the preservation initiative on both sides. People will fight in a win-lose scenario when they think they will win. They might even fight in a lose-lose scenario if they think that the other side will lose more than they will lose. But a lose-lose scenario, which results in the complete destruction of both sides, is not an option for both sides. The threat of worldwide destruction has always been a bleak prospect at the back of people's minds, particularly during the 1950s to the 1980s. During the Cold War, schools would do mock nuke drills, whereby the children would duck under their desks during a potential red alert, or more accurately, a mock red alert. Now, I'm not a physicist, I'm an asshole who tells jokes on the internet, so take my opinion with a grain of salt, but after a nuclear blast, a desk isn't going to stop you from turning into ash. The most well-known close call during the Cold War was the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Soviet Union stationed nuclear weapons on Castro's Cuba. This led to some of the most intense 13 days of diplomatic negotiations between President Kennedy and Khrushchev. The Soviets would eventually move the nukes out of Cuba, and the US removed their nukes from Turkey. Another close call was the Able Archer 83 exercise in 1983, when the Soviet alert systems mistook NATO drills for the first nuclear strike. The Soviets and their Warsaw Pact prepared for an exchange. A Soviet lieutenant colonel of the Soviet Air Defense Forces by the name of Stanislav Petrov came to the conclusion that the early warning system was a false alarm. He disobeyed orders for the retaliatory protocol, thus preventing a nuclear exchange. U.S. Lieutenant General Perotz advised against responding to the Soviet activity, which resulted in the Soviets de-escalating. As a result of these events, Petrov is oftentimes considered the man who saved the world. Eventually, other countries would gain access to nukes. France would prove the world that it was still a major power on the world stage with their first test in 1960. China would gain access to the bomb in 1964, the second communist country to do so. In 1974, India would test their first bomb with the unfitting name the Smiling Buddha, proving that the Third World was capable of producing its own destroyer of worlds. This weapon would be used as a geopolitical tool against their arch-regional rival, Pakistan, which would eventually gain access to nukes far later on in 1998. Back to the Cold War. President Ronald Reagan considered MAD, or Mutually Assured Destruction, to be nothing more than an absurd self-deletion pact. He proposed the Strategic Defense Initiative in 1983, which in theory would be a space-based missile defense system to intercept Soviet nukes. This would make nuclear weapons obsolete and the world much safer. Well, unless you think having nukes makes the world safer by scaring countries away from going to war. And we'll get to this paradox soon. The press at the time widely mocked this as Star Wars, as the technology was not available at the time and probably won't be available for quite a while. more down-to-earth solutions need to be implemented. This had started before Star Wars was ever even suggested. In 1963, PT-BT banned nuclear tests in the atmosphere, space, and underwater. SALT I in 1972 froze the number of ICBMs used by the US and USSR. ICBMs stand for Intercontinental Ballistic Missiles. And in 1987, there would be the INF Treaty, in which Gorbachev and Reagan would ban several types of intermediate and short-range missiles. Part of the reason why these arch-enemies engaged in these treaties to begin with was fear not just of a nuclear exchange, but also a nuclear winter. Nuclear winter is a scenario in which the world cools down after a nuclear war. This is caused by dust and ash blocking out the sunlight. This would cool the planet by several degrees, perhaps even 7 or 8 degrees, which would result in the collapse of our agricultural system as plants don't have access to sunlight, as well as the destruction of countless ecosystems such as forests, grasslands, and coral reefs. This would lead to mass famine and civil strife. The exchange would also lead to ozone depletion due to excess heat in the upper atmosphere. This would also subject survivors to UV radiation. The biggest nuclear winter doomer at the time was an astronomer and science communicator by the name of Carl Sagan. During the 1980s, he wrote extensively about global freezes and civilizational collapse. His warnings prompted the US and Soviet Union to exchange and engage in more restrictive regulations on weapons of mass destruction. However, it turned out that the fears of nuclear winter were exaggerated upon closer inspection of the data. Nuclear winter was not as likely as nuclear autumn. Still terrible, but not as terrible as what was initially warned of. The reevaluation was not only a testament to the intellectual honesty of Sagan and ilk, who adjusted their worldview in line with more evidence, but it also showed us that the planet, humans, and civilization had better odds than we initially thought. Nonetheless, the doomerism around nuclear winter did have a positive impact in the sense that it prompted international regulations. In part because of nuclear weapons, the Cold War did end. And it ended peacefully, not with a nuclear winter or a nuclear autumn, but rather with East Berliners hopping over that ugly crumbling wall to befriend their neighbors on the other side of it. With the exception of Romania, nearly all countries in the Warsaw Pact threw off the yoke of communism peacefully. And in 1991, the Soviet Union would collapse into the Russian Federation and numerous other countries. And of course, I have to re-mention that this led to the last Soviet leader signifying the collapse of communism by showing up in a Pizza Hut commercial.
Sometimes nothing brings people together like a nice hot pizza from Pizza Hut.
Today, the last remnants of communism come in the form of Louis Vuitton revolutionaries preaching Marxism out of their mansions to a legion of rich suburban teenagers. Now, most of the Soviet nukes remained in Russia, but some were stationed in the former Soviet states that were not Russia, namely Ukraine and Kazakhstan. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty only allows the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council to keep their nukes: the US, Soviet Union, later Russia, UK, France, and China. All major parties pressured the Ukrainians to give up their nukes to prevent proliferation. The Ukrainians want to keep hold of these nuclear weapons given their history of repression by Russia. However, they eventually gave them up under the pressure of Russia and Western forces under the pinky promise that Russia would respect their sovereignty. Spoiler alert, this pinky promise didn't work. However, while communism died, nukes still remained. This led to START 1 in 1991, which reduced the number of deployed strategic nukes by around 80%. Strategic nukes are nukes which target the enemy's major cities, but are really used to deter war in the first place. Tactical nukes, on the other hand, are much smaller and are meant to be used on the battlefield. To this day, tactical nukes have never been used, and if you really think about it, they're really not tactical at all, they're strategic since they're meant to make a statement. START 2 took place in 2010, which reduced the number of American and Russian warheads. However, further talks seemed unlikely given the situation in Ukraine. While tensions today are far lower than they were during the Cold War, there are still 9 countries which have nukes. There are the previous 5 I mentioned, followed by India and Pakistan. Israel almost certainly has nuclear weapons, but does not openly admit to it. These nukes are used as a deterrence against Iran. The Israelis also managed to destroy the nuclear facilities of the now-defunct Saddam Hussein regime in Iraq and the now-defunct Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria. Fun fact, the facility in Syria was actually built by North Korea. Speaking of North Korea, they had tested their first nuke in 2006 underground. As fun as it is to make fun of a regime led by a godly atheist double-chinned alpha male getting nukes, it's perhaps quite possibly the most rational decision they've ever made, perhaps the only rational decision this regime has ever made. By owning nukes, they prevent the prospect of a regime change at the hands of an external power. This sucks for people living under this regime, but that doesn't matter when the leadership can prove the existence of unicorns. Nonetheless, the unintentional comedy produced by the regime still makes it scary. After all, their dear leader has superpowers. He can survive a nuclear holocaust. He has nothing to lose. The radiation will either turn him into Daredevil or an obese Asian Hulk. According to North Korean officials, Kim Jong-un reads minds and doesn't even take shits. It's not that hard to believe that he could survive ionizing radiation when he doesn't even have an anus. US allies Japan and South Korea are under the American nuclear umbrella, which in theory protects them from nuclear weapons under the US military. However, some have urged that South Korea and Japan are better off getting nukes themselves, alongside Taiwan, which could develop their own program in a short period of time in order to deter mainland Chinese invasions. After all, deterrence is a powerful tool. Libya got rid of their nukes under the pressure of Western powers, but the dictator Gaddafi was overthrown with the help of NATO's air forces. And Ukraine gave up its nukes, and we saw how Russia responded. The only other example of a country giving up its nuclear weapon ambitions was South Africa. The apartheid government was facing serious allegations of racism and white supremacy and was increasingly isolated, so they produced nukes as a deterrent. However, this eventually was overthrown peacefully, and the new regime, or democratic government I should say, eventually dismantled the program, no longer needing it. Now, another country discussed in relation to nukes is Iran. As I'm writing the script, the Islamic Republic of Iran is facing massive protests at the hands of its own people. What I am saying now might be outdated in a week or two. The Islamic Republic of Iran has claimed to have a peaceful nuclear program for civilian purposes, namely for energy. However, this is just flat-out BS, as its uranium enrichment has risen to 60%, well beyond the percent for civilian energy use, and much closer to the levels needed to create weapons. While some will argue that the Islamic Republic's nukes are a form of deterrence against its enemies, namely the US, Israel, EU, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, and others, it also serves a theological purpose. The Islamic Republic is a regime run by Shiite fundamentalists, with apocalyptic delusions about a messianic figure called the Mahdi who will bring about Judgment Day. These mullahs aren't afraid of the end times, as they think that they're gonna die as martyrs and heroes before being resurrected into Jinnah, paradise, to spend eternity with their 72 virgins. Who cares about life on earth when you get to live in eternity as a hero in a cosmic brothel? In 2025, the US, under Operation Midnight Hammer, destroyed what remains of Iran's nuclear facilities. It's still unclear to what extent their ability to produce a nuke is intact, though. For all I know, the regime might fall by the time I upload this video. Maybe, maybe not. At the time I'm writing this, the Ayatollah is on Twitter quoting World of Warcraft villains. Iran is the one exception where rational game theory doesn't work, as you're not dealing with a rational secular actor, but rather an irrational fundamentalist actor. When it comes to rational actors like Russia and its Western opponents, game theory kicks in. Russia is a much weaker party than North America and Europe combined, or even the US by itself. Under this circumstance, Putin has threatened the use of nukes, but the West has not. This makes sense when it comes to game theory. A conventional military hot war would be won by the West, but a loss for Russia. However, a nuclear exchange would be a lose-lose situation. While reckless and unethical, it makes sense for Putin to threaten nuclear war given that it puts him in a position that, while still terrible, is not at a complete unequal disadvantage. I would argue that countries most likely to start nuclear exchanges are actually not Russia or China or North Korea, nor Israel, nor Iran, nor the United States, but rather India and Pakistan, with Pakistan being the most likely out of the two. Pakistan is in a similar situation to Russia, as it is conventionally weaker compared to India. For this reason, it is a first strike policy, while India has no first use policies, as they can fairly easily defeat Pakistan when it comes to conventional military forces. The matter is made more severe as Pakistan is unstable and more prone to Islamic extremism. Counterintuitively, game theory in many ways makes the weaker power more dangerous than the more powerful force. To this day, I do believe that Pakistan is the most likely country to use nukes first, and given the country's tendency for instability and a love-hate relationship with terrorist groups, a weapon falling in the hands of a jihadi who thinks destroying all the Hindus will send him to eternal paradise has nothing to lose and 72 virgin goats to gain. I think humanity might be a lot better if all these countries just handed their nukes to another country, say Switzerland. They are neutral, plus the only weapons they have are pocket knives, so they could do some better defense. Let's just say that nuclear war does happen. If there was a nuclear catastrophe, the only organic matter left would be some resilient microorganisms, cockroaches, and chicken nugget paste. If we are stupid enough to wipe each other out with nuclear weapons, then maybe cockroaches will survive to form their own complex civilization. Out of all the animals to survive a nuclear holocaust, why did it have to be the cockroaches? Why not flamingos or sunflowers? Now, on a more serious note, if a nuclear exchange were to happen, it would be the worst human-caused catastrophe in history. However, it is unlikely to destroy all complex societies, let alone lead to human extinction. The initial strategic nuclear exchange, depending on the size, could lead to the destruction of major cities and global power centers. This would be disastrous in 20 trillion ways. It would lead to the collapse of the centers of innovation and production. It would lead to the deaths of hundreds of millions of people. The global economy would crash. Crops would die out. Ecosystems would experience mass extinctions of countless flora and fauna. However,
life finds a way.
Certain organisms would survive and thrive in new open niches. This can already be seen in the area around Chernobyl, which at this point is essentially a radioactive wildlife sanctuary. Organisms in subterranean environments, the open ocean, and other remote parts of the world would probably be spared as well. But what about the humans? I mean, sure, it's nice that flower beetles will survive, but I'd like to think that a species capable of exploring space and building skyscrapers is more important than one that ruins bags of flour. Speaking of flour, crop yields would be much lower, and survivors would probably have to rely on processed food left over after the cataclysm, as they have a longer shelf life. One of the oldest episodes of Family Guy is set in a post-apocalyptic wasteland, in which Peter Griffin manages to set up a new society of survivors based off of a giant warehouse filled with Twinkies. While not the best source for getting your macronutrients, Twinkies and other processed food would provide calorie-dense sources of nutrition, if you could call it that, for survivors. Speaking of survivors, the Southern Hemisphere would probably be left unblemished directly, as no major powers reside there. There's a reason why so many billionaires such as Peter Thiel are purchasing land in New Zealand. The Southern Hemisphere would still be impacted though by pollutants, cooling temperatures, and refugees from the Northern Hemisphere. However, their complex societies would most likely be intact, however very weak. Australia, Brazil, Argentina, South Africa, and Indonesia would probably emerge as major power players. However, some of the weaker states like South Africa would probably break apart due to their economic fallouts. Keep in mind that nuclear radiation decreases by 90% after 7 hours and 99% after 49 hours. Hot spots would still be no-goes for years, perhaps even decades. Wind and runoff would spread contamination, making the cleanup process harder. However, keep in mind that this doesn't mean that the entire Northern Hemisphere would be uninhabitable. Eventually, after cleanups in otherwise desirable areas, there could be a rebuilding process like there was in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The lives of the first several generations of survivors would have to be extremely tough. Whatever survival societies are left would probably be vassal states of southern hemisphere nations. Putting the geopolitics aside, I am particularly interested in how a nuclear exchange would impact human psychology and humanity's view of its place in the world. For one, it would set us back several centuries technologically, as the most important centers of innovation and advancement would be gone. Chances are, most human capital would be wiped out. Perhaps, humans would be far more hesitant to build giant death machines anytime soon afterwards. Many of these societies, nonetheless, would probably be a lot more violent due to the loss of rule of law. Would government structures become more authoritarian to consolidate power and deal with the crisis? Maybe some will devolve into straight-up anarchy. Survivor societies would probably value grit, stoicism, and anti-fragility over comfort and sensitivity, and the genes and memes of anti-fragility would pass on to the next generation. How would an event like this impact how humans saw their place in the universe? It turned out that the doomsday cults were sort of right, if this is the case. Would people abandon religion for nihilism, or would there be a new religious revival, or an emergence of new religions altogether to explain and cope with the collective trauma? The doomsday preppers that I made fun of in my first video of this series may have been right, and we better stockpile in those cans of beans. And what would happen if we colonize a solar system before this nuclear exchange? How would interplanetary colonies react to the home planet facing so much destruction? Well, we'll get to that in the next part of the series on alien invasions. Thanks for watching.